There's a specific disorienting pattern worth naming directly. One this entire series has touched on repeatedly, but that deserves its own dedicated examination. The accusations that don't actually describe you at all, but instead describe him. Transferred onto you with enough confidence and enough repetition that they eventually start to feel accurate. Even though they were never actually yours to carry. Today we're tracing 10 specific accusations that follow this exact pattern. Drawing together everything this entire series has established about projection as a core narcissistic defense mechanism. 1. You're so manipulative. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narrative control and strategic reconciliation attempts. This accusation typically arrives specifically when you've done something genuinely reasonable. Set a boundary, requested accountability, declined to participate in a pattern that's harmed you. Reframed as manipulation because straightforward. Honest communication threatens his control considerably more than actual manipulation would. 2. You're always trying to make me look bad. Connecting to everything we've traced about narrative management and image control. This accusation usually surfaces precisely when you've simply, accurately described something that happened. The accusation itself reveals his own preoccupation with managing perception. Projected onto you as though your honesty represents deliberate reputational sabotage rather than simple truth-telling. 3. You never take accountability for anything. Remember everything we've traced extensively throughout our conversation about narcissists, structural incapacity for genuine accountability. This specific accusation is worth recognizing as almost perfectly inverted, arriving from someone whose entire psychological architecture, as this series has established across dozens of conversations, prevents genuine self-examination. Directed at someone who has likely spent considerable energy examining her own contributions to conflict, often to an excessive, self-blaming degree. You're obsessed with me. Connecting to everything we've traced throughout our conversation about narcissistic obsession during no contact. This accusation often arrives specifically when he's the one struggling to disengage. Projected onto you as a way of avoiding acknowledgement of his own continued preoccupation. 5. You're so controlling. Remember everything we've traced about how narcissistic strategy depends on managing your behavior. Your emotional expression, your access to outside perspective. This accusation typically surfaces when you've simply expressed a preference or a need. Reframed as control, because his own considerably more comprehensive attempts at control feel threatened by your having any preferences at all. Together, these first 5 accusations reveal something worth understanding directly. Each one describes, with remarkable precision, something his own behavior actually does. Redirected outward specifically, because acknowledging it internally would require exactly the self-examination his psychology structurally cannot sustain. Let's continue tracing the remaining 5 accusations, examining each one with the same precision. Before we address what this entire pattern reveals about projection as a psychological mechanism worth understanding thoroughly. 6. You're so dramatic. You exaggerate everything. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about manufactured crisis and manufactured urgency as reliable tools for producing engagement and attention. This accusation typically arrives specifically when you've calmly, accurately described something genuinely significant that happened. Reframed as exaggeration, because his own considerably more frequent reliance on manufactured drama and manufactured crisis feels threatened by your simple, unembellished honesty about actual events. 7. You're the one who's emotionally unavailable. Connecting directly to everything we've traced throughout our conversation about the quiet costs a narcissist is already paying. The structural incapacity for genuine intimacy that persists across every relationship, regardless of external appearance. This accusation often surfaces precisely after you've withdrawn emotionally. Following exactly the pattern this entire series has traced extensively in response to his own sustained prosody. Structural inability to provide the reciprocal depth genuine connection requires. Your protective withdrawal, itself a direct response to his emotional unavailability, prosody, gets reframed as the original problem rather than the reasonable consequence it actually represents. 8. You're just like your parents. Or, you have the same issues as previous partner. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narrative construction and pattern. Matching used strategically to destabilize your sense of your own individual reality. Prosody. This accusation deploys a particularly effective form of undermining, suggesting your current, legitimate concerns simply represent old prosody, unresolved patterns rather than accurate perception of his actual, current behavior. Prosody. Deflecting attention away from the present situation and toward speculative psychological history that conveniently shifts focus away from anything he'd need to address directly. Prosody. You're crazy. Or, you're imagining things. Connecting to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about gaslighting as a core mechanism. Prosody. This accusation represents perhaps the most direct, most damaging form of this entire pattern. Taking his own confusing, contradictory prosody, reality, distorting behavior, and locating its source entirely within your perception rather than his actions. Precisely the mechanism we've examined extensively across dozens of previous conversations, central to how narcissistic relationships erode self-trust. Prosody. You never really loved me. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about attention versus love. The crucial distinction between his own structural incapacity for genuine prosody, mature love, and your own genuine, demonstrated capacity for exactly this kind of depth throughout the relationship. Prosody. This final accusation represents perhaps the most painful inversion of all. Prosody. Taking his own inability to receive or reciprocate genuine love and locating this absence within your capacity instead. Prosody. When everything this entire series has established points toward exactly the opposite conclusion. Prosody. Here's what's crucial to understand about why this entire pattern, projection specifically, prosody, rather than simply ordinary criticism or ordinary disagreement, proves so uniquely disorienting and so uniquely damaging to process. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how thoroughly narcissistic strategy depends on narrative control. Projection doesn't simply criticize you unfairly. It takes something genuinely true about him, prosody, something he cannot consciously acknowledge without threatening his fragile self-concept, and relocates it onto you instead, creating a specific prosody, disorienting experience worth naming directly. You find yourself defending against accusations that describe him with uncanny accuracy, prosody, while simultaneously being told these accusations describe you, prosody. This mechanism explains something we've touched on throughout many previous conversations in this series, but that deserves direct emphasis here. Why these specific accusations often produced such disproportionate, lasting confusion, prosody, considerably more disorienting than ordinary criticism typically produces. You weren't simply being criticized unfairly, prosody. You were being handed his own psychological material, disguised as commentary on your character, prosody, requiring you to somehow defend against descriptions that felt genuinely, prosody, uncomfortably accurate, just accurate about him rather than about you. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, prosody, and it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply a catalog of accusations without addressing what genuinely matters most, how to actually recognize projection in real time, prosody, and how to hold this understanding in a way that permanently protects you rather than simply providing satisfying retrospective clarity about what already happened. The first thing worth understanding clearly is a practical, reliable indicator worth applying to any future accusation you encounter, prosody. whether from him specifically or from anyone else who might attempt this same pattern. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about behavioral consistency as the most reliable evidence available. When someone accuses you of something, ask yourself honestly, does this accusation match a consistent pattern in my own actual behavior? Prosody. Verified through my own memory. And, if helpful, through trusted others who've witnessed enough to confirm or contradict it. Prosody. Or does this accusation feel disconnected from anything you can actually identify in your own genuine conduct, arriving instead with a strange prosody? Uncomfortable familiarity that suggests it might actually describe someone else's behavior entirely. Here's the second thing worth understanding: prosody. One that offers a considerably more reliable diagnostic than simply examining the accusation's content alone. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about timing as diagnostic information. Projected accusations typically arrive at specific prosody, predictable moments, precisely when you've done something that threatens his narrative control. Precisely when you've expressed a boundary or a need. Prosody. Precisely when his own behavior has become uncomfortably visible and requires urgent redirection elsewhere. Prosody. Notice not just what you're being accused of, but when the accusation arrives. Prosody. Because this timing often reveals considerably more about its actual function than the specific content of the accusation itself. Here's the third thing worth understanding: prosody. One that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms: prosody. Recognizing this pattern accurately doesn't require you to become defensively armed against every future accusation anyone ever makes. Prosody. Treating all criticism as automatically suspect or automatically projected. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the danger of over-applying protective frameworks in ways that damage genuinely healthy relationships. Prosody. Genuine feedback from people who genuinely care about you, even when it's uncomfortable to hear. Prosody. Deserves genuine consideration rather than automatic dismissal as projection. Prosody. The specific pattern we've traced throughout today's conversation applies specifically to accusations that follow the 10 patterns we've examined. Prosody. Arriving with the specific timing and the specific inconsistency with your own actual behavior that distinguishes genuine projection from legitimate. Prosody. Worthwhile feedback deserving of honest self-reflection. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding: prosody. One that offers something genuinely valuable to carry forward from this entire conversation. Prosody. Connecting to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about rebuilding self-trust as one of the core components of genuine healing. Prosody. If you find yourself still carrying the weight of any of these 10 accusations, prosody, still wondering whether they might have contained some genuine truth about your own character despite everything we've traced throughout today's discussion, prosody, consider examining the actual, accumulated evidence from your own life, your relationships with people who've known you across many years, your own consistent patterns of behavior, verified through honest self-reflection, the accurate account you've likely already carefully constructed throughout your own healing journey. This evidence, prosody, considerably more reliable than anything he ever told you about yourself, offers genuine, accurate confirmation of who you actually are, prosody, entirely independent of whatever narrative he attempted to construct instead. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding: the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. These 10 accusations, examined carefully throughout today's discussion, prosody, reveal something worth holding as genuinely important information about him rather than genuine information about you. Every single one describes, prosody, with remarkable precision, patterns in his own behavior that his psychology could never consciously acknowledge, prosody, relocated onto you specifically because you represented a safer, prosody, more available target for exactly the self-criticism his defensive architecture is structurally built to avoid directing inward, prosody. You were never actually manipulative, controlling, emotionally unavailable, or incapable of genuine love. You were instead carrying accusations that belonged entirely to him, accusations that describe, with uncanny accuracy, prosody, exactly the patterns this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations regarding his own psychological structure and his own behavior throughout the relationship. Prosody. Releasing these 10 accusations, recognizing them clearly as description of him rather than description of you, represents one of the most significantly, most freeing pieces of clarity available throughout your entire healing journey. Not because understanding projection alone completes your healing, but because it removes false, misplaced weight you were never actually meant to carry, weight that belonged, always and entirely, prosody, to someone whose own psychological architecture required you to hold it, simply because he could never bear to hold it himself. There's one final consideration worth adding here, prosody, because it addresses something worth carrying forward beyond simply intellectual recognition of this pattern. What does it actually feel like in your body and in your daily life once these 10 accusations genuinely, completely stop belonging to you? This deserves direct examination, prosody, because the shift from carrying misplaced weight to genuinely, permanently setting it down represents something considerably more significant than simple intellectual understanding, prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how deeply these accusations, prosody, repeated often enough and delivered with enough confidence, can embed themselves into your own self-concept, prosody, regardless of how inaccurate they actually were. Genuinely releasing them requires more than a single moment of recognition. It requires the same sustained practice this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations. Noticing, each time old doubt resurfaces, that this doubt traces back to something he told you rather than something you've actually, prosody, independently verified through your own accumulated life experience, prosody. Here's what genuine release actually looks like once it develops authentically. You'll notice, gradually, prosody, that hearing an echo of these old accusations, perhaps triggered by an unrelated conflict, prosody, perhaps triggered by nothing identifiable at all, produces less and less internal charge each time it occurs, prosody. Where once these words might have sent you spiraling into self-doubt, searching desperately for evidence that you really were manipulative, prosody, really were too much, really were incapable of genuine love, you'll eventually notice something considerably calmer, a quiet, prosody, settled recognition that these words simply don't match the accumulated, accurate evidence of who you actually are, prosody. Evidence built through years of relationships, years of self-reflection, years of genuinity. Demonstrated character that no single person's distorted narrative could ever successfully overwrite, prosody. Here's the truth worth carrying forward as the final word on everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, Every accusation he ever leveled against you was, in the end, a confession, spoken in the wrong direction, aimed at you instead of at himself, prosody, because his own psychology could never survive the weight of genuine self-recognition, prosody. You spent considerable time carrying words that were never actually about you at all. You believed, for however long, prosody, that you might genuinely be manipulative, might genuinely be too much, might genuinely be incapable of the depth and the love you now know, prosody. With complete certainty, you've always been fully capable of offering. That confusion is over now. What remains is simply this: the accurate, complete truth of who you actually are, built not from his distorted mirror, but from your own life, your own relationships. Genuine character, prosody, verified across years and across people who knew you both before and after him, and found nothing resembling the person he described. Prosody, he handed you his own reflection and called it yours. You carried it for a while, prosody, because that's what love and confusion together can make a person do. But it was never actually your face in that mirror. It was always his, prosody. And now, Finally, you get to set it down completely. Walk away from a reflection that was never yours to begin with, and return, fully and permanently, to the truth you always, somewhere, knew you were never the thing he accused you of being. Prosody. You were simply the person standing close enough to receive everything he could never bear to see in himself. That's over now. What's left is you. Accurate, whole, and entirely finally your own.